Hi everyone, welcome to another video in Azure 300 series. This is video number 4, and this video is going to be all about accounts and subscriptions in Azure. We're going to mention what Azure accounts are, what subscriptions are, where do they belong, and how you create some, and then what other parts of Azure account setup is necessary. All right, what can you expect here? So, as I said, we're going to talk about Azure account hierarchy and what all goes in there. We're going to touch base on EAs, subscriptions, management groups, and the terminology in general. We're going to talk about so-called common scenarios or discuss enterprise scaffold, what the enterprise scaffold is, and then how can it be structured. After that, we'll break down the EA structure, who does what and who's responsible for what exactly in one Azure account. We'll touch on Azure blueprints, what those are, where are they coming from, where are they sitting in this hierarchy, and we'll talk about Azure policy. So let's get to it. Azure account hierarchy. So if you were to have a task to create an Azure account or to start your Azure journey within Microsoft, where would you go? What would you do? So the first and best bet would be most probably there will be a person from purchasing department or from accounting department, depending on the organization, uh, that would have to create an account for you in this address, which is ea.azure.com. So Azure, as you know it, is just one of the services that Microsoft provides. And in order to create that service or use that service, you would need to have an enterprise agreement if you're an enterprise. And there's a later on, I'll talk about the definition, what's considered as an enterprise, and how you can have one created for you. But this is what you need to know for now. So after that, and this is again the best practice that's provided by Microsoft that talks about Azure account hierarchy. So after that, you will have something called management group created. I'll talk extensively about management groups later on, just FYI, but for now, just remember the term that after you create an account, EA account, you can create management groups. For those management groups, you'll have departments, and then finally, you can have an account. And this is an actual account that gets assigned to a person. The first account that we're talking about, Azure account, enterprise account, is tied to an enterprise, so to the organization. And the actual account that sits under a department is tied to a person. Then we have subscriptions. So certain accounts have certain access to certain subscriptions. This is what you finally see as a user. So you're going to, as a John Doe, as a user, go to portal.azure.com, and then you're going to log in. So according to your account and to which department you belong to, and then finally to which management group that the department is assigned to, you're going to have access to certain subscriptions or only one subscription. That subscription will have one or multiple resource groups, and the resource groups are, well, as we mentioned earlier, a collection of resources uh, that you might have access to. So after this hierarchy, these are all the steps, and these are all components actually of a well-designed hierarchy, and this kind of hierarchy helps you later down the road when you actually become more mature in cloud and then using Azure. If you set it up this way, it will reduce administrative effort to control your accounts and your billing and everything that goes into Azure. So what are all these terms? I know I mentioned a few terms over here, management groups, subscriptions, accounts, resources, and so on. So let's cover just first Just briefly, what these terms are. So EA, as I mentioned, and it also says on the Microsoft website, the Microsoft Enterprise Agreement offers the best value to organizations with 500 or more users or devices that want a manageable volume licensing program that gives them the flexibility to buy cloud services and software licenses under one agreement. Basically, is a spending account for organization that has at least 500 users or devices. Um, and the spending account, because it promises or gives an agreement with Microsoft that you'll be spending that money, it has some kind of beneficial or reduced pricing, so to say. Um, so that's an EA, important term. Um, Management group. What's a management group? Management group are containers that help you manage access, policy, and compliance across multiple subscriptions. You basically decide in management groups who gets to access what. Uh, you should create these containers to build an effective and efficient hierarchy that can be used with Azure policy and Azure role-based access controls. That's your management group. A department, well, department as we know it in any enterprise is a group of people that is doing similar type of work. Account. Account refers to an entity in Microsoft Active Directory world, and it can be on premises or in Azure. And that entity is being referred to users and or devices. So when you say an account in Active Directory world, there is no really distinction between a user and a device. It is just a number that is assigned to that entity. A subscription. Subscription refers to the logical entity that provides entitlement to deploy and consume Azure resources. Azure has this term or a logical entity that they call subscriptions. And in later examples, when we start doing some demos, I'll also point out to these differences, but for your own understanding, subscription is basically a logical entity or a collection of resource groups that you have access to. And then finally, we have resource groups. Resource groups are a logical collection of virtual machines, storage accounts, virtual networks, web apps, basically Azure resources that you might have access to. Those are your typical terms that we have mentioned earlier that are mentioned also in a hierarchy world, but I just wanted to cover those so we are all on the same page. Why are those important? But then as we further go down this theory path of explaining all the terms within the accounts and subscriptions, you're going to see these terms, and I'll be kind of spending more time on explaining these. So what's next? Next is the hierarchy relationship. So in Azure, this is what you can expect. So when you have Azure enrollment, you basically go and, if you remember, create your account, your enterprise account within Azure. Then you can have one account and then many departments. And that's always the case. Then from the department perspective, each department can be assigned to one account, but then it can have more accounts under it. So if you remember from the beginning, we have two types of accounts. So we have enterprise account and then we have users accounts. And so department consists of users, obviously, and then these users, when they create a department, are assigned to an enterprise account. And then these accounts, these user accounts, have one-to-many relationship to subscriptions. So each account, each user can be assigned to multiple subscriptions. So it can be a dev subscription, it could be a production subscription, And then these subscriptions, as we said, is collection of resource groups or Azure resources. So it's always kind of one too many. It starts from an Azure enterprise account that gets assigned to a corporation, and then from there you can have many of subsidiaries. Common scenarios. So here's an interesting example or multiple examples of Azure Enterprise Scaffold and how these terms and how they can be configured to reduce the administrative effort. So here's an example of a functional enterprise scaffold. On the top, obviously, you have an enterprise, so this is your organization. And then you would have multiple departments. It can be finance, it could be IT, it could be HR, whatever department that you have that would need access to Azure. And then, if you remember, the next, so one too many. So you would have multiple departments. Then from there, you're going to have account owners. So um, in those departments, each department is going to assign an account owner that would be administrative person. And then each department can have one or many account owners. And then these account owners will have the subscriptions assigned to them, which could be a test subscription, production, EA, all types of subscriptions depending on how you organize your work. So, but this is one scenario where you have a functional scaffold, so a functional common scenario. Then you will have a business division. So depending how big your enterprise is, you would have one or multiple divisions. But in case it has multiple divisions, I've seen this kind of way of enterprises dividing their access to Azure. So if you're doing multiple divisions, you would have again one enterprise, so one too many. Departments are going to be divided into auto division and an aerospace division, and then again you will have owners of those departments, and the subscriptions are going to be divided to one or many subscriptions to those owners, which again belong to that department. And then the third scenario, common scenario, is geographic. This is also a very common scenario because as each big enterprise it would have multiple locations, but it will have multiple geographic locations. It depends on the continent. So it would have one in Australia, you can have one in Europe, you can have in the United States or North America in general. And this is how your departments are going to be divided one to many. Okay, we covered the common terms, the common scenarios. Let's see what kind of enterprise breakdown or what kind of enterprises agreements you can have. So this is more referring to once you have created your enterprise agreement, you would have certain users assigned to that enterprise agreement or that enterprise account in Azure, and these are default users. So I want to just touch base on what you can expect to see in Azure um, getting created by default, by the get-go. So you would have 4 different users. It will be enterprise admin, department admin, account owner, and then service admin. And these administrators are going to have different type of access to your Azure Enterprise account. And most important one is if it can add multiple users after that, if it can do certain actions, because it's important who gets assigned what kind of access to create your enterprise in Azure, basically. All right, this is all very standard Microsoft documentation they have put together. It is important to touch on this because depending on a project to a project, but you will see this being repeated in your real world once you actually start working on a project and start discussing this kind of topics. It will always come up as who has what kind of access. So let's touch base on Azure Blueprints a little bit. This is a very important topic, so I'm going to dedicate a separate video for Azure Blueprints, and it's going to be either a video 5 or 6, but Azure Blueprints is a relatively new term that Microsoft is trying to introduce, and it's also Azure service. So, and it's important because it can have a lot of power, and it can have a lot of it can reduce a lot of administrative efforts, especially when you're trying to recreate certain scenarios. You're trying to recreate certain um, environments. So what is an Azure Blueprint? An Azure Blueprint is a package for creating specific sets of standards and requirements, so-called artifacts, that govern the implementation of Azure services, security, and design. In other words, blueprints are a declarative way to orchestrate the deployment of role assignments, policy assignments, Azure Resource Manager templates or ARM templates, and resource group. So you would compose your architect, so you would put them together through code or to just dragging and dropping, but most commonly it's through code. After you compose those artifacts, there is a service that you create in Azure that is called Azure Blueprints. Those artifacts are going to be saved in that service. This service is global, so it's not really tied to any of the um, data centers, Microsoft data centers. So if one goes down or region, if one goes down, then you lose your blueprints. That is actually not correct. So it's a global service, and it can be useful because, as you can see, you can create your ARM templates, you can create your resource groups, and then just redeploy them through these blueprints. So you would compose an artifact, you would then manage it within the service of Azure Blueprints, and then you can redeploy them or you can scale them out to multiple subscriptions. This is a pretty decent, pretty good solution um, to do scaling and basically reduce the effort of recreating your environments because you're going to create artifacts and that's going to speed up whole process. So as I said, I'm going to create one of the future videos is going to be dedicated specifically to Azure Blueprints, where I'm going to just demo how to accomplish all this. So I just want to paint a picture a little bit, um, so you have in your head is what you can expect, but it's a very useful service. So Azure policy. Let's touch on this. This is a very important term, and sometimes it is confused with Azure Blueprints, but I'm going to try and be very thorough about explaining what Azure policies are. But if we step a little bit back and see where Azure policy is coming from, it's important to understand where this policy is stemming in Azure Enterprise. So if you would think about Azure as a Microsoft product, these policies, basically rules, are going to control something in Azure. And it's important to understand how, when they are set up, how do they do this? So basically where they're sitting in Azure world. So if we look at the overview of management services in Azure, we can notice that management of Azure resources is divided in 6 areas. So I kind of tried to put this um, in 6 different areas, but I'm going to paint a picture here and then. So the first service that Azure always kind of gets you with and talks about is Azure Migrate, which you use services that help assess the migration and migration suitability of resources to Azure. And these services are Azure Site Recovery, database migration tools, so anything that you can basically migrate your services or tell you that your services can be or cannot be migrated to Azure. So the other um, area, the second area, is called the Azure Secure area. And this area deals with services that manage the security of resources and data in Azure. So-called Azure Security Center does that. So it specifically deals only with security management and threat protection. The third area that Azure does really, really well and focuses on is protect. And these services that keep applications and data available. It helps with business continuity. So this is where your backup is sitting. This is where your disaster recovery is sitting. Um, and as I said, throughout these areas, we're trying to locate where your Azure policy is sitting, is located. So the next uh, the next area is monitor. This area services or these services collect and analyze data to audit the performance, health, and availability of resources. So it will be basically any service that Azure can provide that um, help you improve the performance of your uh, application. So one of them, or the most famous one, is the log analytics and diagnostics service. The following area is configure. So this area refers to services that are used to initial deployment or for initial deployment and configuration of resources. So this is all that's referred to when you're building your application or any kind of infrastructure in Azure. And the very last one is govern. And govern area of government is or governance provide mechanisms and processes to maintain control over application and resources in Azure. And as you can see, this is where policy management is located. This is where it's all coming from. And let me see now to kind of try and explain how does all this fit together is Azure governance architecture. So this is important to understand as well. So we're trying to locate again Azure policy and how this is all communicating with each other. So if you would start here from the left, so this is where you define your policies, role-based access, ARM templates. This is where all this is sitting. You have management groups, you have subscriptions. You're putting all this stuff together. So this is where you're putting your code, and you can deploy that through Azure Blueprints, or you can go and just deploy it through your code. Uh, all of this, as you can see a dotted line here going through the code, but it will at some point go through some kind of policy engine. You can have that, so that policy engine is always there. You can deploy those policies or not, but the policies engine is always there. So every time you deploy some kind of code or do some kind of work, it will initiate some kind of code at the back end, um, which is your Azure Resource Manager. And then this um, code will be then checked with the policy engine. So if you have your policies in place, um, you can, it will be then double checked and either approved or declined, but it will then perform the action of through your resource providers. So this is the way how the code works. So you would deploy the code, it will be checked through the policy, and then it would do something to a resource in the resource provider, either create one, change one, delete one, and so on. And after all of this is said and done, in Azure Resource Graph, you can query all the changes or all different deployments that have happened. Um, okay, so this is where we capture and this is where we see where Azure policy is sitting. Um, so basically, what does Azure policy do? Azure policy enforces and makes it compliant. Basically, is all about enabling built-in policies or building custom ones, and it does the real-time evaluation of these policies. Policies at scale is all about applying policies on multiple levels, and remediation is all about real-time remediation. So in this particular case, enforcing compliance is if you have a list of policies that are being set up and enabled, they're going to be enforced. So if you deploy a code or try to make some kind of a change to your resources, it will have gone through that circle of Azure policy check. And if they are being compliant, then great, they execute. These policies can be applied on scale. So if you create a set of policies, they get applied to a subscription, and everything that belongs to that subscription can be or will be checked. And then remediation is it will just provide certain steps that um, how you can remediate your issues or potential issues. So this is the fourth video that talked about Azure accounts, enterprise accounts, and subscriptions. It also touched some other things in what you can do in Azure, but there were some terms that did not exist when this exam started, but I wanted to have them included because they're very important and new and also come up in a test, which are Azure blueprints and to a certain way Azure policies, because the way how they're set up as well as management group, the way how they're set up is this is how they're going to dictate um, your enterprise, and as part of part of Microsoft best practices, they're being very encouraged to set up. Um, so hopefully this has given some answers and some light into accounts and subscriptions. If it did not, that's really not a problem because I will be touching on this topic uh, more often in demo videos because we will be setting up policies, we will be setting up some of the management groups, as I said, and the way how these videos are structured. I'll be just going through the theory so I can paint some kind of picture for you to understand what you can see and what you can expect in the future um, when we do some demos. So without any further ado, let's get ready for video number 5, which will cover um, Azure Blueprints and demoing Azure Blueprints, more importantly, how they're being set up and how they're being used. Thank you.